Greetings and welcome to the latest event in the Gies College of Business Teaching and Learning webinar series. I'm Amanda Brantner, Senior Associate Director here at Gies College of Business at the University of Illinois, and I look forward to spending the next hour with you. Our faculty experts have developed a series of webinars to address some of the pressing issues businesses face today, from the economic impact of COVID-19 to cybersecurity and ethics. These webinars enable you to be better prepared to succeed and thrive through any number of challenges. Before we get started with how can artificial intelligence effectively augment human intelligence with Professor Aravinda Garimella, I want to cover a few housekeeping items related to the Q&A portion of today's session. Please submit all of your questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. Your questions will be submitted publicly for the whole audience to see. In order to develop consensus around questions, please use upvoting. The upvote thumb is located next to the question in the Q&A window. We will bring the top questions to Professor Garimella following the presentation. Any general housekeeping questions will be answered in text by the Gies team working in the background. It's my privilege to introduce today's presenter, Aravinda Garimella. Aravinda has an incredible passion for her students and her research. She teaches on database design, digital platforms, and information systems. Her research specializes in digital platforms, online communities, and the topic we'll learn about today, human-AI interaction. She's a leading expert on this subject, which is growing in importance every day. I hope you're as excited as I am to hear what she has to share. Please join me in welcoming Professor Aravinda Garimella.
Thank you, Amanda, for that lovely introduction. And a big thanks to the entire team that worked on coordinating and putting together this webinar. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you're logging in from today. And I'm excited to talk about artificial intelligence and how it can effectively augment human intelligence with you over the next 40 to 45 minutes, after which I'll hand it over back to Amanda for Q&A. So today, artificial intelligence is widely used throughout the world to make important decisions that have far-reaching impacts. Nearly all Fortune 500 companies use some version of automation or AI in their hiring process. And it's not just recruitment. Banks use algorithms to assess individual creditworthiness, to decide whom to give loans to. Doctors use artificial intelligence to aid with medical diagnosis. And so there are a lot of important tasks that used to be done primarily by humans before and are now done by this kind of human AI partnerships. So artificial intelligence, it's not an overstatement to say that it's one of the most defining technologies of our times. And it has great promise. It has the potential to empower individuals, to empower communities. Just as one example, Microsoft has an intelligent app called Seeing AI, and it helps visually impaired people to experience their surroundings in a way that was never possible before. But of course, like with any great technology, with this promise and potential, there are also some risks. So it's very important for us to understand this technology well, so that we can then leverage the benefits that come with this technology and hopefully minimize or mitigate the downsides. So with that, I'll lay out the agenda for today's discussion. I'll start with a brief, broad introduction on what is AI, right? After which we'll compare and contrast human intelligence to artificial intelligence. And then I'll talk a little bit about biases in humans and in algorithms. And finally, I'll talk about building effective human AI collaborations. And depending on how we're doing it with time at that point, I might spotlight some interesting research we're doing here at the Gies College of Business in this area. So what is AI? I'm going to give a broad definition that I think that is useful to understand the manifestations of artificial intelligence that we most commonly see around us in the world these days. So broadly speaking, artificial intelligence is the ability of a machine to perform cognitive functions that we typically associate with human minds, right? So what are some examples of these cognitive functions? We think these are things that humans can do. These are faculties of the human mind, human brain: decision-making, learning, perception, creativity, problem solving, and reasoning, right? And AI, at least the way it is today, in its current state, has gotten really good at doing some of these things, like decision making, which has a lot to do with prediction and forecasting. AI is almost in almost every situation better than humans at prediction and forecasting. Learning, definitely with neural networks and supervised learning and reinforcement learning. We have now, it's fair to say we have machines that can teach themselves, right? But there are other areas there where it's not that clear. So creativity, you may have seen AI wrote a song, recently, the GPT-3 algorithm, it wrote an entire article and it created some waves. So I think when you lost my audio, we were talking about what is AI. So let's start on the next section of today's presentation, in which we'll compare and contrast human and artificial intelligence, right? Human and artificial intelligence have their unique strengths, unique and complementary strengths and weaknesses. And by understanding these strengths and weaknesses better, we can hopefully build systems that effectively marry the strengths and hopefully mitigate some of the weaknesses, right? So let's talk about human intelligence now first. So consider games like chess and Go, and just think about how many possibilities, how many possible moves exist in games like this, right? And we see some humans who play these games incredibly well. And this is a fascinating window into human intelligence, right? So if you take the game like Go, for example, there are, and this is just an estimate, there are 2 times 10 to the power of 170 possible positions on a standard Go board. Okay, that's 2 followed by 170 zeros. That's a number we cannot even fathom, let alone work with or strategize with, right? And so it is fascinating to see how the best Go players make their moves. And when you see some of these champions play and they make a really strong move and you ask them, how did you know that this was the right move to make? Often their answer is, I don't know. When I make a move, I know it's the right move. Or when I see someone make a move, I can tell that's a good move or that's a bad move, but I don't know what makes a good move, right? And this is not specific just to chess and Go players, right? If you, in the world of sports, there are some really good scouts and team managers who draft players who they think will have successful careers, right? And if you ask them, well, how do you know this player is going to be good on the field? They say, I just know a good player when I see one. I don't know how, right? And if you think about your own professions, you reflect on what you do on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure over time, you would become, you are experts on one particular task. You just know how to do it intuitively. You may not be able to explain how exactly you get it right each time, but you do over time, right? And so there's this inability to explain how we do some things right, but we just happen to get them right. And this state of affairs is beautifully summarized by the Hungarian-British polymath Polanyi. And he said it so succinctly in one sentence. He said, we know more than we can tell, right? And that's the paradox. The paradox is that we know a lot of things. We can do complicated things, but we are able to articulate, even understand, let alone articulate the thought process behind only a subset of those things, right? So Polonius Paradox has a lot of important implications. In fact, it had important implications for the way AI evolved as a field, right? So in the beginning, there were kind of two approaches or 2 camps, if you like. There was the rule-based approach where some people said, well, if we want to make an intelligent machine, what do we do? We think about how we make decisions, come up with rules, and we give the machine the same rules. So obviously the machine will start behaving like a human then. But that didn't go too far. Why? If you think about it, this is why, right? Because of Polonius Paradox. We are not aware, we're not cognizant of all the rules that our brain uses at arriving at a decision. So how can we train a machine on those rules then, right? So that's why the second school of thought, or the second approach took over, and which is statistical pattern recognition, right? What we see today as machine learning around us, right? So the machine learning approach is different. It says, let's not give the machine any rules. Instead, let's expose the machine to lots and lots of data and hope that it picks up on some patterns, right? It's a little bit like how kids learn languages. Before kids go to school and formally learn the rules of grammar, they start talking well before that, right? And how do they do that? Just by listening, just by picking up patterns. So through exposure, experimentation, repetition, and feedback. And that's how machine learning algorithms work. So this was a bit of a detour, but I wanted to tell you that this is one of the implications that Polonius Paradox has, right? And going back to human intelligence, a real good framework that provides a really nice window into human intelligence is the System 1 and System 2 thinking framework proposed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky over their decades of incredible research in cognitive science, in decision making, in cognitive biases, right? And they beautifully collected all of that into a famous book. Many of you may know what book I'm talking about. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. So every behavioral researcher, anyone who's interested in decision making has read this book. I highly recommend it. It's very accessible. So in Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman and Tversky explain System 1 and System 2 thinking, which are two modes of human thinking, right? So System 1 thinking is fast, intuitive, quick, sometimes emotional. And System 2 thinking is deliberate, slow, with reasoning, right? And we need both. As humans, we need both. Why? Because sometimes you have to react quickly. You don't have time to methodically, go through all the steps of logic. You have to make a quick decision. So System 1 comes in handy there, right? And System 2, and System 1 is also what people develop with a lot of skill and experience, intuition, right? And so what is intuition really? We say intuition as if it's some superpower or some sixth sense. Intuition is basically just a lot of experience, a lot of exposure to data and pattern recognition, right? So that's System 1 thinking. System 2 thinking is more deliberate, right? Just to give you a quick example of the two, let's say you're driving from your workplace to home, right? You just turn the car on and you kind of just happen to arrive at home while doing a million other things, right? You don't consciously think, I have to take a left here, I have to take a right here, right? You're listening to the radio, doing many other things. But let's say you were in a new town where you didn't know directions and your navigation wasn't working, and you just had verbal instructions, right? There, your System 2 thinking would kick in, right? Because you would have these directions and you'll be more deliberate in the way you're driving. So that's System 2 thinking there. So why are we talking about System 1 and System 2 thinking here? Because both of them come with their own biases, strengths and biases, right? And we need to kind of understand this and understand what AI is doing well at, right? And that's a very long conversation to be had, is like which parts of this is AI good at? But broadly speaking, much of the advances we see today in AI are in System 1 thinking, right? Because I spoke about this earlier, what AI is really good at is pattern matching and making those quick decisions that are scalable, right? System 2 thinking, reasoning, knowing why, the why of things, we're not quite, we're working on that, but we're not quite there yet, right? And so with that, I spoke a little bit about human biases here. And by the way, if you want a full list of biases, you can either read the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, or you can go on to Wikipedia and just search list of cognitive biases, and you'll see dozens and dozens of biases. It's fascinating to know the limitations of our mind, which will hopefully make us introspect a little more. Right? So let's now move on to biases in algorithms. Okay, so in 2016, ProPublica published this really important piece, was called machine bias. And what they investigated in this article is an algorithm called Compass for recidivism prediction, right? And what they found is that this algorithm is biased against Black defendants. So I made a simple table here for you to see yourself. The algorithm labeled as high risk 45% of Black defendants who actually did not reoffend. But this number was only 24% for white defendants, right? On the other hand, 28% of Black defendants were labeled low risk, but they did reoffend, but this number was 48% for white defendants. So this obviously is concerning, to say the least, right? And the company Northpoint, which developed this algorithm, they disputed the story. They said that their algorithm was misunderstood, and they argued that a statistical measure called PPV, positive predicted value, in their algorithm was the same for Black and white defendants. So this is actually opens up an important and interesting conversation about the idea of fairness notions in algorithms, right? You could develop algorithms with multiple different notions of fairness, right? This fairness plurality. So let me try to explain this. So let's say you're trying to design the system, right? One approach is I am going to optimize for true positives, which means that I want to identify as many people as possible who will reoffend. So if you focus just on this, then you are going to have some false positives. You're going to classify some people as likely to reoffend when they won't reoffend. Let's say you say, okay, no, I will not take that approach. Instead, I will design my algorithm to optimize for as few false positives as possible. That is, I'll be careful never to label someone as high risk if they're not likely to reoffend, right? Then you run the risk of a lot of false negatives, which is you're going to label a lot of people as low risk when they're in fact high risk, right? So this is a complicated problem. And the point I'm trying to make here is it's a broader conversation. It's not just for algorithm designers or engineers. This is a conversation for society at large, lawmakers, policymakers. They need to have an understanding of how algorithms work so that they can be involved in prioritizing. They can put forth guidelines for what should we prioritize in our algorithms, right? And you can adjust the dial. So one thing that's worth noting is, I hope at this point at this point of the talk, I've made this point that humans and algorithms both suffer from biases. But with algorithms, you can adjust the dial. With humans, not so much, right? Implicit biases are hard to overcome. But with algorithms, you can adjust the dial. But how to adjust the dial, and whichever way you adjust it, we'll be trading off one bias for another. But that's a conversation to be had at a larger scale. And so this actually is a window into why it's very important for people working on AI and lawmakers and policymakers to have an ongoing conversation. So going back to biases, right? That was one of the first articles that really created waves. It certainly wasn't the last. Apple Card, for example, showed some gender bias. It was giving higher credit lines to men as compared to women of similar profiles. Facial recognition softwares weren't working as well on minorities. And Amazon, more recently, many of you may have heard of this, their recruitment software was favoring resumes which used words that are more commonly found in male resumes, right? And that actually provides a nice segue into the next thing we're going to talk about, which is the sources of bias in algorithms, right? Where do these biases come from, right? The first thing there is biased labels. So what do we mean by labels? So how do you train an algorithm? You give it a lot of training data. So you show it a lot of history and the outcomes in the history, and you expect that using that, it can make predictions for the future. So in Amazon's case, what they might have done is fed the algorithm a lot of resumes, and the outcome variable, which is whether this person was hired, is what we call the label, right? So they must have fed tens of thousands of resumes or hundreds of thousands of resumes to train the algorithm. But what they missed out on, what they did not factor in, is that those labels, whether those people were hired in the past, itself is a human decision which is susceptible to biases, right? And it's almost a given that we as humans, there is proof now, enough proof that there is bias against women, against people of color. So the danger then, if you don't think about this carefully, is that these implicit biases in humans enter algorithms and become like proper codified systematic biases in the algorithm. So that's something to be very careful about, right? The second source of bias can be imbalanced representation. For a range of reasons, it's just difficult to get data on from some groups, right? And so there's a good example for this is the city of Boston tried to come up with, it was actually a very innovative app. It was to detect potholes in the city using an app. So they used an accelerometer and the GPS to detect potholes in the city. But what happened here is that people from poorer neighborhoods were less likely to have smartphones and thus less likely to download this app. So their data was not getting uploaded to the app as much. And if you think about it, where are most of the potholes? In the poorer neighborhoods, right? So this is a case of imbalanced representation, right? And then there's data quality disparity, which just means you will get data from everywhere, but the data from some groups is either incomplete or inaccurate, and you're not factoring in for it as well as you should be, right? So what are some methods to correct biases? Again, this is a very big conversation. I could develop a whole course just on the last two slides, detecting and correcting biases. But quickly, there are some ways in which biases in algorithms can be corrected. One is you can do data pre-processing, which is if you're certain that one field or one feature in your data set does not really impact the outcome and may bias the algorithm, should consider removing it from the algorithm, right? Or not giving that information to the algorithm. But I mean, this is not easy. I'm giving a really simplified version of this. There's a lot of things to consider before you do something like this. The second option is to add fairness constraints explicitly, right? So in the recidivism example I gave earlier, you could add explicit constraints to your algorithm. Every algorithm is trying to optimize on something called an objective function. So you can add terms to the objective function so as to adjust the dials explicitly, right? But the fairness constraints, what are they? That's the tricky part there. We have to, as a society, agree on what it means to be fair in these situations. And then there's post-processing predictions as well. So what that means is, let's say you don't have a way to clean your algorithm to get it rid of biases. Then you get the output from the algorithm, but you have this understanding that this algorithm is producing biased outputs. And so the way I use it has to be careful. So if you know a bias, an algorithm, let's say for granting loans is biased against men, against women and people of color, then maybe you should have different thresholds for different groups, right? Because in this situation, when the algorithm is biased, then having same threshold isn't equal opportunity, right? But that's not easy either. You have to think about what should be these thresholds and things like that. So these are some methods to correct biases, right? So let's talk a little bit now about how to build effective human AI collaborations. And after that, I'll talk a little bit about the research we're doing here at Gies in this area, right? So to build effective human AI collaborations, we need to bear in mind that yes, humans have some biases that machines don't, but we also have some strengths that machines don't, right? So we have to think about how to put human intelligence into the loop of decision making. And it has to be very deliberate, thoughtful, introspective, and careful. So one thing humans are good at is common sense, right? And common sense is hard to teach, not just with machines. If you look around you, you'll see some people have a lot of common sense. Some people don't have that good common sense. And you'll see it's really hard to teach the ones that don't. You can't teach this, right? So there's something called the broken leg role, which explains this. Let's say an algorithm, its task is to predict whether person X will go watch a movie today, right? You can train this algorithm all you want. You can give it all the data, like the weather today, like the day of the week, like person X's calendar, how busy they are. And you can make it really good over time. But let's say person X breaks their leg one day. As a human, yeah, no, this person's not going to go watch a movie today. But an algorithm, as long as you have explicitly told about the broken leg rule, it will predict that the person may go to the movie, right? And you can't possibly teach about the broken leg because there's a million broken legs. There are so many things that we cannot foresee or take care of proactively. And that's where common sense kicks in, right? The second thing is, from time to time, have a person check the computer's decisions, evaluate it. This is called taking a look out of the window, because pilots, for example, in the modern day, they almost entirely depend on the flight's navigation system, right? And the flight's navigation system does the whole job pretty much on its own. But the good pilots say that once in a while, you got to look out of the window, you got to look at the skyline for yourself and make sure everything looks okay, right? So that's what you mean by taking a look out of the window. And then keep score. What's meant by that is, if you're using an algorithm in your company, in your business firm, whatever, with your consumers, see how the algorithm is doing over time. Track accuracy, and not just accuracy, track how it's doing with different groups, with protected groups. And if you think that the algorithm is not doing that great, you need to take corrective steps. But this cannot be a one-time thing. You have to continuously do this. And actually, I think about now, one of the things I did not put on the slides here that is coming to my mind right now is, we also need to change the way we train people now very quickly. In fact, I would say it should already be happening. Universities have to train students to work effectively with AI. So students who graduate now and from now on will possibly be working with AI in some form or another. So the way we teach our students how to be good team players, right? We have to teach them how to be good team players with AI, so to speak, right? Even in companies, you train people how to work efficiently with AI. This kind of new mindset needs to be developed, right? So with that, we actually have plenty of time for the research spotlight. Maybe I spoke too soon, I don't know, but I'll talk a little bit about the work I'm doing here at Gies, and then highlight some of the really exciting work that my colleagues are working on. So one of the projects I'm working on right now, so what I spoke to you till now was kind of broad, but research, always you answer a very specific question, right? So the specific question we are trying to work on is, how do humans react to algorithmic inputs when working on complex tasks in high uncertainty environments? So that's the specific problem we're looking at. I'm working on this project with Professor Wen Han, who's an assistant professor in our area, Information Systems and Operations Management, and Shaunak Basu, who's one of our doctoral students, and Professor Alan Dennis from the Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. So to answer this question, we found an interesting research context. If any of you are into cryptocurrency or ICOs, you may be aware of this platform called ICObench.com. So ICObench.com is a rating platform. Trading doesn't happen there, just to be clear. So entrepreneurs, they put out their coin offerings or their projects on this platform, and experts go and rate each of these offerings on a scale of 1 to 5, right? And so investors come and check it out and say, okay, let's see which of the ICOs are likely to do well, right? Based on the human ratings. But what's really unique about this website is there's a bot. It's called Benchy. And Benchy, as soon as every offering is posted, Benchy will first give it a rating based on an algorithm. And the human experts get to observe this rating and then make up their own minds and give a rating, right? So from what we've discussed so far, I hope at this point you're thinking, all right, Benchi's rating will probably be based on quantitative, tangible, objective criteria, but we expect the humans' ratings to depend on more than that, right? The qualitative, the intangible, the je ne sais quoi, so to speak, of these initial coin offerings. So what we ask is, when and to what extent do humans align their ratings with the bot, right? And so for that, we use the theoretical lens of anchoring. Anchoring, again, this is one of the biases Kahneman and Tversky talk about in their book. It's the tendency of humans to depend too heavily on an initial piece of information, right, to make their judgments. So we look at anchoring and we think, okay, maybe they will use the bots, the rating as an anchor, right? So what we actually found through our analysis, without getting into too much detail, is evidence for this phenomenon called asymmetric anchoring, right? So what we found that is in risky markets, where there's a high likelihood of failure, humans will align the bot when the bot makes the safe choice. So when the bot says that this project's not going to take off, humans agree with that. But when the bot says, oh, this one's going to take off, then humans sometimes agree, sometimes they disagree, they exercise more independent thinking. So it's as if the humans are very concerned about making sure nothing's overrated, but they're not as concerned about making sure something's underrated, right? And you may wonder, how do they know about overrated versus underrated? That's because we actually have data on how these coins eventually end up doing on the market a year later. So we know which are the good projects and which are the bad projects. So that's an interesting thing I'm working on with my colleagues here. But my other colleagues here are doing really fascinating work as well. Professor Aaron Hassan, he has worked with his co-authors on a bias-aware classification algorithm for breast cancer diagnosis. This, in fact, just 2 days ago, it won the Best Paper Award at the Information Systems Research Journal. And this is really important and impactful work. One of our doctoral students in marketing, Nadia Danienta, she is looking into how consumers respond to AI recommendations, right? From a framing angle. And this is, in fact, her dissertation. She's working with Professor Arik on that. And my colleague Iris is working on how to design interventions to mitigate overreaction bias to algorithmic errors, which is well documented in the literature, in an inventory replenishment context. So there's a lot of interesting, and this is just a subset. You know, we have a very research active group here, so I'm sure there is work I'm not even aware of. So we have a lot of interesting work in this area, in marketing, in supply chain, in healthcare, as you can see Erin's work. And I guess to summarize, as an AI researcher, it's a great time to be at Gies, right? And so here are some of my references and resources for today's talk. If any of you are interested in reading more, I've listed some books here, some of my favorite books on the topic, and some articles, and a podcast. I cannot recommend the Lex Friedman podcast quite enough. It's one of my favorite podcasts. If you like AI, please check it out. And with that, I will wrap it up. I was worried about going over time, Amanda, but I'm under time here.
No worries, Aravinda. It's a great presentation. Thanks for sharing all of your thoughts. We've got some good questions from the audience and would love to see those keep coming in. So to our attendees today, if you have any questions for Professor Garimella, please submit them in the Q&A and upvote any questions you see that you're particularly interested in. With that, I'll go ahead and get started and bring you some of the questions from the group. A number of questions reflecting on your comments around AI bias. And so want to follow up on that a bit. One of the questions is, can we eliminate the bias by eliminating the reference? In other words, if trying to eliminate the bias towards African Americans, can we not have that as a criteria in the data set? Or are there other ways that we can teach AI to eliminate bias over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, that is one of the three strategies I discussed to address bias. it's not as simple as yes or no, but that is definitely a strategy, is to not expose the algorithm to criteria that may bias the algorithm and you think don't have a bearing on the outcome that it's trying to predict, right? So, but in this case, to say that, yes, that's the way to go, that's a very, there are a lot of things to consider when you remove a feature from a data set. But that's, that's what data pre-processing is thinking carefully about what information, maybe in general, the more features you give to an algorithm, the better it'll perform. It's as simple as that, right? But maybe um, eliminating some features is not such a bad idea. Great question.
Thanks. Thanks to the audience for that great question and for upvoting it. Switching gears from the bias question, this question is around AI and machine learning relying on data. What do you see as opportunities to incorporate big data analytics into AI and the integration between these two things?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that these are already quite integrated. Your AI will perform as well as the data. So that there's a common saying in this area that garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you give your AI little sparse data only on some groups, it's not going to do well, right? If you give it big data, like, again, depending on how you define big data for that particular context, the more data you give an algorithm, the better it's going to perform. Yes, there is, obviously these fields have been working at the same pace. They've been advancing big data analytics and AI, but they're very much intertwined. And advances from big data analytics are helping AI and vice versa.
This is our most upvoted question. News feeds from social media sites tend to feed stories confirming confirming the confirmation bias of the user, which, as we have seen recently, results in more polarization of the electorate, for example, in the instance of our recent elections here in the United States. How can news feeds be recalibrated so as to be more neutral?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So that's a great question, and I'm sure at this point many of you, especially whoever asked this question, has watched Social Dilemma, right? The Netflix documentary that delves into this in great depth. I guess they delve into the problem into great depth, but they did not propose a lot of solutions, in my opinion, anyway. Yeah, that's something companies like Facebook and Twitter, they all have to think about very deeply, how to not polarize people. One thing we can do ourselves, which I try to do, is subscribe to people to pages that have a different worldview than your own, right? Companies have a lot to do, have to work on this, on not polarizing, right? So maybe there's an optimal level at which they should learn about people, and they shouldn't learn more than that, if that makes sense, right? Because they're trying to tailor all the content to exactly you and all attributes of you, but maybe they should do it to some extent. And there's this notion in AI of exploration versus exploitation, right? So when you know a lot about a person, you can exploit that and show them exactly what they like. But another strategy is to show them something that they were not thinking about before, right? And I think over time, if platforms don't do more of that, they don't do more exploration, expose us to diverse views, they'll start losing people. So that's something platforms should do. But as a user, and I think that there's some regulation angle to this too. I won't get into that now. We may need to have some laws in place about how much these things are customized to us. But as a user, I think trying to subscribe to different worldviews, views that differ from your own, may help overcome some of this polarization problem.
Thanks. That's a really interesting topic to think about, and I'm sure one that impacts all of us. Thanks for a thoughtful answer to that question. Can you talk about the relationship between algorithm bias and data bias?
That's a very good question. Yeah, and throughout this talk, I was kind of using AI and algorithms kind of interchangeably. Just let me get some basics clear and then answer that question. So AIs are powered by algorithms, right? So what is algorithm? An algorithm is just a bunch of steps. So I can write an algorithm to make tea, right? Fill the kettle with water, turn the kettle on, take a tea bag. That would be an algorithm to make tea, right? AI is powered by algorithms plus data. So we spoke today in the webinar, I spoke a lot about data biases, right? How having incorrect data can, or incorrect as in misleading data can lead you to misleading conclusions. Algorithm bias is, yeah, in the code itself, if you're not taking care of some aspects of fairness, that's where algorithm bias comes in from. And that's where I was talking earlier about coding into the algorithm explicit fairness constraints. That's how you can correct algorithm bias, right? If you feel that I can only fix the data so much, then you need to work on tweaking the objective function of the algorithm if needed, right? So both these biases are in place, and hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
Thanks. When a couple of questions in the chat here, the Q&A around AI and specific industries that it can impact or create growth in. One specific industry mentioned is aviation. Do you have a sense for where you see AI having the greatest impact industry-wise in the midterm? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me think about that. I think so in sales, I think we see a lot of AI already in things like e-commerce, right? You go to Amazon, your recommended products. So there, I don't think that's midterm. That's already happened, right? AI is kind of driving your purchasing behavior almost. So instead of industries, I'll just talk about kind of like the ways in which AI can be used, and I'll tell you which ways I think I see coming in the near future. So there are really three ways in which AIs and humans work together. One is task substitution, where AI does the job that used to be done by a human, right? One is task augmentation, where AI is doing something complementary to the human, right? They both are doing what they're good at. And one is, I think this is called task, it'll come to me, task substitution, augmentation, and something else. This is a task-based view of AI. And that is like dynamically humans and AI just kind of working as an integrated unit. I think the last thing we're still far away from, and that will take some time for humans and AI directly to dynamically to work together. We're doing some substitution, but I think we should focus a lot on this augmentation space where humans and AI leverage their relative strengths, and we don't put them in areas which are their weaknesses. That requires careful thinking and careful design decisions. So I could name industries, but I feel like there's no point in singling out some. AI is pervasive now. It's entering all industries, but this thought process should hopefully help answer that question to some extent.
Yeah, thanks. As you think about those different types of ways or opportunities for AI to influence work, and the integration between AI and humans, what are some of the human qualities that make AI human collaboration more effective? Are there personality factors, individual characteristics, training, things that you can think of that influence humans to be more effective collaborators with AI?
Yeah. And I'm very interested in this. Actually, there's some scholars in Minnesota right now working on this problem exactly. Like, how do we make, people better team players with AI, right? And so yeah, I would say that training definitely. So I would say more training than intrinsic attributes of some people being able to do this better than others. I would lean towards saying we need to just educate people on what are the challenges with working with AI, and what the human's role is in that loop where you work with AI. So I would say training is a big part of what we should be focusing on to build some of these effective collaborations.
Thanks. This is a question about AI algorithm effectiveness and recognizing that in order for an AI algorithm to be effective, it requires a huge collection of raw data and some maturity in the algorithm. The panelist comments that, or the attendee comments that organizations wanting to implement AI, often struggle with the lack of data and matured algorithms. Do you have any recommendations on how organizations can overcome that lack of data or immaturity in algorithm?
This is a very pertinent question, and this is a double-edged sword. You need more data to make better AI algorithms, but the collection of data itself is making some people feel uncomfortable, the way our data is being collected and mined, right? So I think companies should collect more data in a responsible manner. And I think that'll bridge that gap. You need to be upfront with people about what data you're collecting about them. Not sell it to third parties without their consent, and if you are collecting somebody's data, they should be an explicit information about that. They should have a chance, they should have some agency in that decision. They should have the chance to say, I permit my data to be collected. And they should be told exactly what their data is being used for. And I think if we change our principles or our working style to this style, more people may be willing to, sometimes when somebody asks me some data for a particular research project, I'm willing to provide that. What makes people uncomfortable is they don't know how their data is being used. So I think companies need to do better with being transparent about how they're using their users' data, and also being responsible, using it exactly for that purpose. So if they do that, my hope is that they'll be able to collect more data. I think people are scared because they don't see that transparency. And hopefully that'll help us build better algorithms.
Great. I have a couple of more questions here, and then would love to have some closing remarks from you, Aravinda. This question states, when developing AI, it seems like its purpose is to perfect the AI to the extent of what humans could do, or more, by reducing the bias. If this is the case, what is the unique set of humans' characteristics that would be fundamentally different from the AI?
Fundamentally different.
Yeah.
Right.
What's the unique set of human characteristics that would be fundamentally different from the AI?
Yeah, I'll talk about some positive characteristics and some not so positive characteristics of humans that would be fundamentally different. Positive is some of the things I talked about towards the end of my talk, right? Common sense. Maybe AI will learn common sense, but it's going to take some time. At least with our current architecture, it's going to take a lot of time for AI to develop common sense, right? Nowhere near. So that's something fundamentally I believe humans will still have a role to play in. On the flip side, fundamentally what's different about an AI and humans, AI is not trying to hurt anyone or it doesn't have any bad goals of its own. It doesn't have any goals of its own. It does whatever it's programmed to do, right? But humans can sometimes have malicious intention. AI cannot have malicious intention. It's just that it will become so good. The risk for us as humans is it's going to become so good that whatever goal is programmed into it, it'll go get that goal, regardless, and regardless of the restrictions. So what's fundamentally different on the flip side is that AI can be, as I said before, you can adjust its dials, and humans, not so much. So that's the positive and negative of the roles that humans can play along with AI.
Thank you. One last question from the group here. What about auditing algorithms? What the attendee states that they understand that's being started and done with some success. Do you have any thoughts on what's being done in the space of auditing algorithms and how that will influence the future?
I haven't read much about the auditing, but it's needed. So that's one of the things I was talking about earlier, about taking a look out the window, right? And also about keeping score, right? So you audit, if you don't audit the algorithms from time to time, then you will not be cognizant of the pitfalls of how the algorithm is working, right? So no, I don't have any specific knowledge on that, but that's the direction we should be moving in, more of that.
Yeah, great. Well, Aravinda, I want to leave it to you for just a quick closing remark on the topic before I close things out for today. As we do that, Kyle, if it's possible, we'd love to see the references slide in the background. A couple of attendees have asked about some of the recommendations that came from the webinar. If we can't get that up, it will go out to all of our attendees here.
I have it here, so I can show that
as well. So to you, Aravinda, for a few closing comments.
Sure. No, I mean, thank you for the opportunity. I thank the College of Business. I thank the entire fantastic team that worked on putting this webinar together. And I thank all of you for logging in and tuning into this discussion and for the excellent, thoughtful questions. This is a very important area that is of immediate importance that we understand this well. Not everyone needs to be an AI expert, but we're at a point where everyone needs to understand a little bit about how it works, right? And as I said before, especially lawmakers, policymakers, they need to, sometimes you hear some of the Senate hearings and it's very clear that they don't have even basic understanding of how technology works. Well, that needs to change. That needs to change because technology is everywhere now, and we need to understand that so we can develop laws and policies accordingly. And having said that, this is a very vast field. We have only, touched the surface of it today. And it's also a field where many other fields come together. AI is at the intersection of computer science, of statistics, of philosophy, of ethics, of economics. There's just so many fields come together at AI, and that's why I find this area so fascinating. I hope today the intention was not to give all the answers, but I hope you feel a little intrigued to learn a little more after today's webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aravinda. It's been great to hear from you on this topic today. We really appreciate all of your great insights and the thought-provoking responses to so many questions from our attendees. Thanks also to our participants today for attending this webinar and bringing those great questions. We'd love some feedback from our participants, and we'll now launch a poll as we wrap up. We hope you gained some valuable knowledge, and we hope you'll join us for the next webinar on Tuesday, December 10th at 1:30 p.m. Central. During that webinar, Professors Kevin Hartman and Ron Guyman will try to answer the question, do data analysts need cookies? We look forward to seeing you then and hope you have a great day. Thank you.